I've decided to make my own response to Paul Joseph Watson's video, Why Capitalism is Great. Watson's video was full of mistakes and moronic contradictions. Here is one example to start off with.
Socialism extorts money from the successful and gives it to the lazy.
It's 2013, that's still good, right? That's like 2 years?
But even for those needy people who fall behind, capitalism provides a safety net via the welfare state, paid for by taxpayers as a result of wealth creation because of capitalism.
Laughable. After watching that clip, you will not be surprised to learn that his supporters seem to be knuckle-dragging troglodytes. These comments were left on the Libertarian Socialist video response to Watson. You will not be shocked to learn that Watson's supporters actually think these are good arguments. All I see is childish abuse and stupidity. I believe that these people demonstrate why we have the block button. Why would you bother wasting your time with these idiots who simply lower the tone of the debate? Now let's begin.
You actually did resist capitalism with any degree of success. The following would not exist. Twitter, the iPhone you're tweeting hashtag resist capitalism from, the internet.
Firstly, it was the US Defense Department that invented the internet, and the iPhone is only around due to government-funded research and technology. Without these government-led scientific breakthroughs, there would be no iPhone. And of course, Twitter wouldn't exist without the internet. So your entire argument is idiotic from the beginning, which isn't very surprising, especially when we look at the caliber of your supporters. Complete idiots.
Socialists don't even know what capitalism is. They confuse capitalism with corporatism. Corporatism is the opposite of free market capitalism because it depends on collusion between well-connected large corporations and the state. Socialists.
Corporatism is the most common form of capitalism to exist. People like you tend to call more successful corporatist countries free market capitalist success stories, while you call all capitalist failures corporatist. It's a joke. Of course, you prove me right when you call countries that are clearly corporatist capitalist miracles. You are the king of cherry picking.
Socialism is toxic to a healthy society because it punishes success and rewards failure.
I don't understand why conservatives continue to worship Thatcher when her economic record was disastrous. She doubled poverty and unemployment during an oil boom. I consider that to be disastrous incompetence. Just look at the stats in front of you. What would these right-wing clowns say if a socialist had have been responsible for these disastrous statistics?
Failure, as Winston Churchill said. Socialism is the equal sharing of miseries.
Churchill was a complete hypocrite. He not only supported the nationalisation of the banks, but kept many industries that were nationalised by the Attlee Labour government in public hands. He also supported the establishment of the National Health Service, the socialist healthcare system.
Socialism disincentivizes success, meaning that businesses which make profit and create jobs, and people that actually produce and contribute to society, flee from countries that embrace socialism to those that embrace capitalism.
Socialism has nothing to do with high taxes. Socialism is about collectivizing the means of production, whether it be through worker self-management or public and state ownership through nationalization. See, you can't even get the basic facts right.
Look at the capitalist miracle in China. In the last 3 decades, China has lifted more people out of extreme poverty than the rest of the world combined. 680 million people have escaped poverty in China thanks to capitalism.
Your stupidity is unbelievable, although you are still not as bad as your fans. China has a planned economy with massive state-owned industries, the biggest companies in China, and the wealthiest people in China tend to have strong connections with the Communist Party. The fact that anyone can describe China as a free market economy is laughable. You have completely lost the plot. Why not use Russia as an example? They went from communism to capitalism, and this was the result. Massive drops in life expectancy. Russia's GDP contracted by 40%, more than it did during the Second World War, and poverty exploded. I can see why you were more willing to call the Chinese command economy an example of free market capitalism, whilst avoiding the issue of Russia. Your beloved ideology caused more damage to the Russian economy than the German invasion did during the Second World War.
And it's a similar situation in India. Look at the standard of living in countries that reject capitalism. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, yet its socialist government struggles to even provide its people with milk, flour, and toilet paper.
You clearly have no idea about the economic history of Venezuela. The government before the current one implemented neoliberal reforms, and the result was a massive increase in poverty, GDP per capita collapsing, and the economy laying in ruins by the time the socialists were elected. Now, I'm not denying that Venezuela has severe economic problems, but your ideology, as proven in the 1980s and 1990s, would be far worse for Venezuela.
But over in capitalist Chile, which has virtually no natural resources, its citizens enjoy the third highest living standards in all of America, beaten only by the US and Canada. Compare places like
No natural resources? Actually, Chile has the largest copper reserves in the world. He can't even get that right. The economic history of Chile is quite interesting. Let's start with the Pinochet dictatorship. When it came to the economy, Pinochet followed the economic platform set out by Milton Friedman's Chicago Boys. In 1982, although growth lagged behind other Latin American nations, Milton Friedman declared that the military government had brought an economic miracle to Chile. 1 year later, in 1983, poverty was around 50%, unemployment had peaked at 20%, and the economy was in deep recession. These were homegrown economic problems too, caused by Milton Friedman's nonsense and the government's incompetence. So what did Pinochet do? Well, he decided to restore the minimum wage, nationalize all the banks and many other industries to save the economy from total collapse. And the monetarist experiment was declared a complete failure. So, Pinochet was not only a human rights abuser, but also an economic failure. By the way, Chile's most successful company is the state-owned copper company, which was nationalized by Mr. Allende, who Pinochet overthrew in a coup.
Canada. Compare places like Hong Kong, which has no significant natural resources, to Cuba, which has an abundance of them.
Easy. Hong Kong is a city that entirely relies on trade, has no army, no navy, and relies on the armed forces of the People's Republic of China to protect them. Cuba has been under an embargo for more than 50 years, has fought off attempted invasions, Bay of Pigs for example, and has to maintain a decent-sized army, navy, and air force in order to defend the country. So, here he is, comparing a country that has been under an embargo for 50 years and threatened by the world's strongest military and economic power to a trade port that does not even have its own armed forces. Sorry, the comparison is idiotic and stupid. Perhaps you should have compared Cuba to capitalist Haiti, which is a far fairer comparison. But you wouldn't want people to look at that comparison, would you?
Before Castro's communism, capitalist Cuba had a per capita income higher than Spain and Portugal. After
That was because the US had a far more justified embargo on Franco's Spain during those years. During that embargo, 200,000 Spaniards starved to death. So it is hardly a surprise that Cuba, which was receiving massive economic aid, was doing better than the last two isolated fascist states in Europe. When they put the embargo on Cuba, they lifted the embargo on Spain.
Like Cuba, Hong Kong was under an embargo from its nearest superpower, China.
He is comparing the economic power of the US to the economic power of China. China was a desperately poor nation after the Second World War. Just look at these Chinese citizens living in Shanghai in 1946. And Watson thinks China was a superpower. No, it was a third world country that was far behind the US and the Soviet Union in terms of economic and military power. Does this fool think India was a superpower as well? How does this guy get away with talking such nonsense?
North Korea, with capitalist South Korea.
The great lie. Rightists like to claim that South Korea is an example of free market capitalism. It is not. South Korea had a command economy where the banks were nationalized and private industry were forced to obey government directives. If they did not obey government directives, their companies would be forcibly nationalized. There are many great documentaries about South Korea's economic policies during this period. Here is a clip from what I think is the best documentary.
Even more than in Japan, the government told businessmen what kind of factories were to be built and where. The pride of the new Korea was to be a huge steelworks. Park said, "Steel is national power." A workforce of tens of thousands was commanded by a former general with a can-do military approach. If the workmanship fell below standard, he had it blown up.
Anyone who tells you that South Korea's economic success was due to free market capitalism is a liar. It was a mixed economy, state-owned industries, like the steel company you just heard about, and private industry, all obeying one economic plan set by the government. That is not free market capitalism.
Anti-capitalists point to Sweden as an example of a country that embraced socialism and prospered, but that's completely wrong. Sweden only began to prosper in the mid-90s after it dumped socialism and embraced lower taxes and privatization.
Sweden is just an example of regulated capitalism with a strong welfare state. That is not socialism. The only Scandinavian country that is slightly socialist is Norway. Its publicly owned oil company has given the Norwegian people a high standard of living. Now, if it was up to Paul Joseph Watson, Norway's oil would be the private property of some billionaire who would hardly pay any tax. That is what these right-wingers think good government is.
People who support socialism are also far greedier than those who support capitalism.
How can people who believe in the common ownership of the means of production and using the state to help the poor, elderly and the disabled be more greedy than those who don't want to pay taxes, attack those on welfare, which include the unemployed, disabled and the sick? Only an idiot would make that claim. Indeed, you sneer and mock a person who is receiving a disability pension in this very video.
Conservatives are more likely to be pro-capitalism, while leftists are more likely to be pro-socialism. Leftists associate capitalism, and therefore its most ardent supporters, conservatives, with greed and a lack of charity. However, studies show that poorer conservatives are more generous than wealthier liberals when it comes to giving to charity. So it's actually leftists who claim to be more concerned about the poor and needy, who are the most miserly when it comes to helping the poor and needy.
Liberals don't support socialism. They support free market capitalism. Hayek, Mises, and Milton Friedman all describe themselves as classical liberals. Liberal does not mean socialist. Also, your ridiculous poll does not negate the fact that conservatives happily support governments that make life miserable for the disabled and the poor, whilst cutting taxes for the richest people in the country.
America's poverty line for a family of 4 is $63 a day. In the poorest countries, which haven't embraced capitalism, it's $1.25.
Actually, most poor nations have embraced capitalism, and it has not worked out too well. See Niger, for example.
Poverty. So go back to your mom's basement, don your Che Guevara t-shirt, and genuflect beneath your hammer and sickle flag. But please, don't inflict your colossally retarded hashtag on the rest of us, because you've got no idea what the hell you're talking about.
So we have come to the end of his ill-informed rant. I want to finish with these points. Venezuela was in a far worse state when a government committed to free market capitalism was in power. Pinochet's economic reforms resulted in a poverty rate of 45% and unemployment around 20%. Free market capitalism caused greater damage to the Russian economy than the German army's invasion did during the Second World War. Thatcher's free market reforms resulted in the waste of North Sea oil, unemployment and poverty doubling, and 2 recessions occurring in the space of 10 years. So, I have provided you with historical facts, statistics, and other forms of evidence. Watson's rant, on the other hand, was full of mistakes, contradictions, and appeals to emotion.